us the next talk, which focuses on another recording scheme. And we're certainly getting a lot of variety in our Diptera today, from the Mediterranean to the coasts and now into bird and bat nests. So over to Denise to introduce another group of fascinating flies to us.
Okay, can you see my PowerPoint?
We can.
Okay, and it's in the proper mode and format and everything and looking good?
It looks good to me, yep. Okay,
brilliant. Well, I'm Denise Wawman. I'm the Hippobosidae part of the Hippobosidae and Nycterobididae recording scheme, which we started in November last year. The other half is Erica McAllister, whom you will all know really well. I have to say, I'm not actually a proper entomologist. I feel, you know, I'm not really, you know, as qualified as anyone else here to comment on a lot of things, but I'm working hard at this. I'm really more of an ornithologist, but my background is in medicine. So this was quite a steep learning curve for me, but hopefully, you know, I'm getting there. So I'll give a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you an introduction to the Hippobosidae and Nycterobididae and talk about the species in Britain and Ireland, the history of recording in the UK, and the 2021 Mapping the UK's Flatfly project, and then finish with the number of records that we've got so far. So both groups, the Hippobosidae and the Nycterobididae, are obligate hematophagous ectoparasites, which basically translates as parasites which are blood-sucking clingers-on. They're brilliantly adapted for their lifestyle. The flat flies, which I'm afraid I will talk mainly about these because I know more about these than bat flies, are really flat, as you'd expect from the common name. They're also known as louse flies across most of the world. They have an ability to scuttle sideways, so this allows them to escape from their host that might try and remove them as it preens. They also, some of the flat flies which can fly, and not all species can, are capable of really fast silent flight to actually land on a host. Now, both groups are part of a group that used to be formerly known as the Puparia. It's the same group that tsetse flies are in. So they have an unusual life cycle. The females don't actually lay eggs. They keep fertilized eggs within the uterus, and one at a time they allow these eggs to feed from what's known as a sort of milk gland. The larvae develop inside the uterus up until the final instar, when they're released and they rapidly pupate, forming a puparia, or puparium, sorry. So the flat flies are parasites of birds, the keds of large mammals, and the bat flies, obviously the Nycterobididae, are found entirely on bats. In the UK, we currently have 12 species, and there's been one accidental import. That's the flat flies, 3 species of keds and an accidental import, and there are 3 species of bat flies. You can find the list in Peter Chandler's list. Your best guide for identification at the moment is Tony Hudson's 1984 Royal Entomological Society of London guide. You can download this free of charge from the Royal Entomological Society's website. So an introduction to some of the species. The bat flies, we've got 3 species. I'm not going to attempt to even pronounce this one. They're only found on bats, so part of this problem with studying most of these flies is that they're only ever seen on their host. These, you can find the puparia in bat roosts, but the flies themselves will almost always be on a bat, and not many people handle bats, so if you want to study them, you need to get in contact with bat workers. This is the one, you know, as I say, I can't pronounce. Very strange looking things. Virtually everything in them is vestigial. They're really small. Most species are between 2 and 3 millimeters. And the other species, you know, they're very weird. They tend to rest with the head over the back of, let me just put my pointer on. The head folded back across the top of the thorax, so that they look really strange, like there's not really any fly there, and the head sort of tends to come down when they feed. These are the ones I know a bit more about, the Keds. So we have 3 species of Keds in the UK. Probably the most familiar to people will be Lipoptenis cervi. This is also known as the deer Ked, and you may see these in large swarms, probably found throughout the country, anywhere there are deer. Hippobosca equina, it's also known as the New Forest fly or the forest fly. This one seems to have a very local distribution from what I can tell at the moment. There's a population around the New Forest, but there's also quite a large population on Dartmoor. I'm wondering if it might be associated with wild horses elsewhere, and I have looked on Exmoor but not found it. The sheep Ked, Melophagus ovinus, is probably extinct on the mainland. We're not sure. It would have suffered dreadfully during when dipping sheep was compulsory, and but it is still found in some of the Scottish islands where sheep dipping didn't take place regularly. Then coming on to my favourite group, the Batflies, which is the group that I'm actually studying as part of my PhD. I'm only going to consider the most common species that you're likely to see in any detail. We've got Craterina pallida. This is generally found on swifts, although occasionally on other hirundines, so your swallows and house martins. It's quite distinct because it's quite sort of fat-bodied, almost conical sort of shape, if you look at this one. And the wings are quite short, they can't fly. They're quite wide at the base, and then they sort of tail in the apical region to a point, which is quite short. Then we have Stenopteryx hirundinus, which is also known as Catarina hirundinus. You'll find it listed as that on iRecord and a lot of other data websites. The name keeps changing backwards and forwards, and I think from having a look at some of the things online, it's probably heading back again. This has a sort of long scythe-shaped wing, which, if it were in its more sort of normal resting position, would end about here, which actually has quite a narrow base, and it's slightly smaller than Catarina pallida, tends to be slightly lighter colour, and this is found almost entirely on house martins and sand martins, and occasionally on swallows, and very occasionally it's been recorded on swifts. We then have the Ornithomia. We've got 3 common species and 1 infrequently recorded species. The largest is Ornithomia avilicularia. Now, with this genus, what you're looking for is these 3 veins here, and then you've got 1, 2, 3 cross veins. This one on the discal cell is usually not filled in all of these. If you start seeing similar looking flies, where these 2 veins here are merged virtually on the costa for sort of this apical length segment here, I'm going to get very excited and I want to know about them. Also, if you start seeing a similar looking fly with a 4th vein running here, I would be very interested. But generally, this is the largest, Ornithomia avilicularia. They're found across a range of birds, mainly supposedly the smaller flies on the smaller birds, but it doesn't always hold. So particularly on crow family, finches occasionally, blackbirds, woodpeckers, those sort of birds tend to have a lot of this one. Fringulina is also found on finches and generally smaller birds. This example I put in here not because it's a particularly good example, but because it's an unusual example. They can vary in colour a lot, so you can't really use the colour very easily for identification. This one is particularly green. This will have a wing length of about, it's the smallest of them, it will have a wing length of 3.5 to 4.5 millimeters, whereas avilicularia is quite a bit bigger. Its wing length is up to 7 millimeters. So a range of sizes in them. There's a middle-sized one which I haven't got a decent photo of called Ornithomia chloropus. So if you want to distinguish them, there's a good key in Hudson, but sort of main pointers from it are that you want to be able to see the bristles on the scutellum well, although these aren't necessarily a good thing. And you want to be able to look at the patterns of microtrichia, so little tiny hairs all over the wing, particularly in cell 3R and 1M. And they vary in colour a lot, but supposedly Ornithomia chloropus is supposed to be darker, with darker markings on the undersurface. However, there's a bit of a problem with all this. A recent paper came out about 6-8 weeks ago by Valerie Lebescu-Bowden and Bradley Sinclair, who are working in Canada, has looked at the coming up with a phylogeny of these and has disagreed with everybody a lot of other identifications. So it may be that we have other species, or some of the species we think we have in the UK is the same as the North American species. So there might be some changes in this, so watch this space. At the moment, from talking to Val, she feels the best way to identify them is looking at the wings. So again, cell 3R has quite distinct patterns, particularly if you look towards the distal end of the veins here with the size of this gap and whether it's present or absent. So if there isn't one, it's probably a gap in the microtrichia, it's probably Ornithomia chloropus. If there is a gap, you've got Fringulina or Avilicularia, and with a quite big difference in size between these two flies, it should be fairly easy to sort them out. The only complication is that we have got the two North American species, Angineria and Bequatii. It's going to get much harder to actually tell them apart, but we'll wait some DNA sequencing on that and decide. They're also a possible vagrant species, Ornithomia biloba, which we've got 4 UK records discovered so far. It's usually found on swallow, but there is one odd record from a paddy field warbler. There's also another Ornithomia which might be found in Gibraltar or Crag Martin if we get that bird as a vagrant. In the UK, we might just see it, but again, it's quite distinct in this sort of gap in R3. So recording in the British Isles has been quite under-recorded, because most are only seen by those handling host species. We've got Lipotina cervi and Hiboska equina quite well recorded because they have a tendency to swarm. But I don't think it was helped by those two doyens of entomology and parasitology, Miriam Rothschild and Theresa Clay, who wrote in their book that they found louse flies particularly repellent insects because they're basically covered with ugly backward-facing spines. So I looked at potential sources of historic records. There's some in the scientific literature. There's a lot of grey literature, so bird observatory reports, local history, local natural history society group reports, approach county diptera recorders. There's local environmental record centres, museum collections. A lot of those, though, aren't fully curated. iRecord, NBN Atlas, GBIF, and then I've searched the internet for searches of species. And I found Tony Hudson and Harry Beaumont were particularly helpful in pointing me in the right direction with things. So where's the oldest record I found? Well, 1752, first reference to Hippobosidae in the British literature. Unfortunately, there's no date, but there's some quite interesting descriptions. So there's a swallow's nest fly it's described of, which is quite clearly Stenepterops hirundinus, because it's the only species with long, narrow wings. And then there's a round-bodied hippobossid, which I think might be Craterina pallida. There's others I can't quite work out what they are. And what's possibly Hippobosca equina is confused with ticks and horseflies. So the first useful record I found is almost inevitably from Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne, where I've managed to find records which I can reliably ID from 1773 for Stenepterops hirundinus and 1774 and 1781 for Craterina pallida. He also discusses that Hippobosca equina is a problem with horses in the area and how local horses get used to them. But if anyone brings a horse into the parish from an area further north, they've never come across the flies and go wild when they start getting bitten by them. So sources of more recent records, there are a few studies. There's quite a lot by bird ringers at the various bird observatories. There are particularly in this point. Then we've got Gibraltar Point in Lincolnshire, a no longer extant bird observatory in Northumberland. We've got Stoke Island Bird Observatory having done some studies. Rymead's Ringing Group got involved at one point. And obviously there's Tony Hudson's studies at Beddington Sewage Farm in Surrey. The Soay Sheep Project of St Kilda records Melophagus ovinus. And Clive Turner did some work, published a paper on Hippobosca equina on Dartmoor, and he's currently resurveying the area and looking. But I've not managed to see any targeted species of Nycterobididae, although to be honest, I haven't looked quite as hard as I have for the Hippobosidae, because it's partly Erica's area. So the first UK-wide attempts at recording were collations of existing data by Thompson in the early 50s. Unfortunately, we can't really use his records for most species because he didn't distinguish between Ornithomia fringulina and Ornithomia chloropus. But we can get a good idea of distributions from Hill, 1962 paper for the 3 species of Ornithomia. He didn't do any work on the other 2 species, the common species, the Syneptrops hirundinus and the Catarrhina pallida. Thompson did that and basically showed that they were all across the UK wherever the swallows and house martins were found. So we can see that the Ornithomia chloropus is sort of mainly a northern species. The other 2 are probably more southern. But we don't really know where they are now. So I started something called the Mapping the UK's Hippobosidae project. So in 2002, I did a pilot scheme. Then this year, I've done a more targeted approach. I've approached bird observatories, bird ringers for target species in specific areas, bird ringing groups, rescue centres, dipterists groups. I put an article in the British Trust of Ornithology's Life Cycle magazine. Started a new Facebook group called Hippobosidae UK, and I've been using Twitter. I'm also planning to use the data that comes in from the recording scheme partly for my PhD for some of the work I'm doing. With the collection, I sent all my volunteers instructions, the inevitable risk assessment, recording schemes, inevitable consent form, pots for catching flies, tubes, ethanol, and a stamped addressed envelope at the start of the flat fly season. And people have been sending me flies quite regularly. My volunteers are across most of the country, but if you're a dipterist living on the sort of northern fringes of Scotland anywhere, and you're able to go out and catch flat flies, I would be delighted to know, because I have a few gaps, and a strange gap that there don't seem to be any bird ringers in East Cornwall for some odd reason. So this is all obviously plotted by Watsonian Vice counties. I've also got a couple of wildlife rescues, 4 wildlife rescue centres involved as well. But we've had Brexit issues with Northern Ireland, Southern Islands and the Channel Islands. They're trying to get records from them because nobody seems to know what protocol is for posting samples. So if anyone does, I'd be really keen to hear. So currently in the scheme, well, when we started, we had 30 records on iRecord of Hippobosidae and 1 Nycterobididae, and there were 5 records on iNaturalist. We've now got 188 records on iNaturalist and 2 of Nycterobididae. Most of the records are Batflies and Keds, most commonly Lipotinus cervi. The 17 records come through out of iNaturalist, and I've obtained a large number of spreadsheets from local environmental record offices, though I'm still waiting for some to answer. A lot didn't have any records at all. There's various natural history groups that I've got records from, and some museums. and I've managed to data mine about 1,273 records from published literature, virtually all of which are Hippobosidae. And I've got over 1,200 specimens for my mappings project, but I've got about 700 of those still to ID. So managing this database is going to be a bit tricky because everything seems to be in a different format. So really, that's about all I've got to say. Any questions, or more importantly, any advice for someone starting up a new scheme?
Thanks very much, Denise. That was a fascinating overview of a group that I suspect is not terribly well known, even to people who are dipterists. And it's amazing to see how much coordination you're putting into bringing in the information from lots of different places. I don't know whether Mark or Zoe are able to tell me whether there's any questions that have come up in the chat box.
Yes, thanks, Martin. There are a couple of questions. I am going to whiz through them quickly because I'm conscious that we are running a lot over time, and poor Rob is waiting in the wings. Okay. Do you think that Hippobosca equina are reduced by insecticide application on horses? And also, the sheep Ked fly was suggested as a bat species about 10 years ago, but they couldn't do that because it's a pest. So I think that's just a comment, not a question.
Yeah, I think drenching horses and everything has really had an effect, as the same as sheep dipping, and the local farmers, they're continually drenching their animals for worms and things, and I think that's had a major effect on these parasite species, and that's why we're not seeing them. But deer Keds are continuing because deer aren't actively managed in the same way.
Okay. Comment from Sue Taylor. I found one of this group in my hair! Exclamation mark. I sent it to the NHM for the attention of Erica and Ines on the DTOR project. But Sue has got some photos if you'd like to receive those. Denise, we can sort that out afterwards. Darren Williams, question about Ornithomia behaviour. How strong a flyer are there, Ornithomia? He's wondering how much of their time they spend flying versus resting on the host.
We don't really know. I mean, we know that the puparia will drop off the host bird because they don't stick or anything. They're just sort of really round and shiny. So they fall off and they probably end up on the ground, unlike the other species where they're probably shared into a nest because they're mainly on nestlings. So they've obviously got to fly and find a host, but they do seem to be quite strong flyers. I mean, they can really give me the run around when I'm in my bird ringing room and I'm trying to catch them, and you end up sort of climbing on the surfaces trying to catch them off the windows and everything before you lose track of which bird they came from. So they can fly quite fast and quite strongly, which is, quite amazing, really.
Interesting. Okay. One from David Lewis. Have there been efforts to gain records from wildlife veterinary hospitals? I think you've done that, haven't you?
Yes, I've done that. I've got 4 wildlife vets at wildlife hospitals actually collecting them for me, and a range of other parasites which turn up at the same time, because I tend to just get given anything that anyone finds, so any fly that comes off a bird. So I may be approaching other people for ID help with those.
Right, and we've got 2 thank yous from Charles Dewhurst and Darren Williams. And with that, I think we are done with the questions and we can move on to Rob.